what happens is when we don't allow our feelings, they get stored and go sour. When emotions get active, we actually move into quite a toxic state, and we say things and do things that later we can easily regret.
Welcome to the Field Dynamics podcast. We're here to facilitate inspiring dialogues about the nature of consciousness across disciplines, communities, and practitioners, all with a holistic perspective.
From energy healing to somatic therapies, from neuroscience to meditation, we believe the most interesting things happen at the boundaries of disciplines.
I'm Christabel.
And I'm Keith.
Thanks for joining us today, and enjoy the episode. Hello and welcome to the Field Dynamics podcast. Today's episode, we are joined once again by Diana Richardson. Diana Richardson is known as the pioneer of the slow sex movement. Born in South Africa, where she completed a 6-year law degree, she subsequently trained as a massage therapist and body worker in the UK and USA, and is a teacher of holistic massage and deep tissue rebalancing. In 1979, while in India, she became a disciple of the Indian mystic Osho, and her interest in meditation, touch, and healing initiated an exploration into Tantra. Some of the books she has written are The Heart of Tantric Sex, Tantric Orgasm for Women, and Tantric Love, Feeling versus Emotion, co-authored with her partner Michael Richardson, and first published in 2010. Together they are based in Switzerland, where they continue to guide couples in the art of slow, conscious sex in their highly successful Making Love retreats. Diana has been a speaker on TEDx, sharing her insights about how sex can be much more than our mainstream culture relates to it. Diana shows us how sex can be a genuine method for self-exploration and spiritual development. Welcome, Diana. It's a great pleasure to welcome you back on the show.
Oh, it was so sweet and lovely to be with you again. I very much appreciate the opportunity to share this information, and also appreciate what you are doing, bringing into the field.
Thank you. You're well known for your bestseller, The Heart of Tantric Sex, as we shared there in the bio, which we discussed more in our interview with you earlier this year. Today's episode, however, we are dedicating to a theme that often dominates and steers our lives in so many ways, and that's emotions. More specifically, emotions in the context of relationships. So emotions can obstruct our outlook on love and impede the very thing that we most long for in our relationships, to be present and fulfilled, able to enter into a deeper connection with others. So today we're going to be talking with you and considering what is this difference between emotions and feelings, and how we can learn to free ourselves from these unconscious forces. So to open, Diana, you have observed many relationships over the years. What patterns and dynamics are you encountering on a regular basis?
There's two, basically, Christabel. The first is what we talked about, in the last podcast we had together, is about difficulties with the sexual connection. And the other aspect, the second aspect, is about the arguing and fighting that often goes on with a couple, that accompanies them, for weeks, for days. Sometimes they don't talk to each other for ages. And so this is a real stumbling block. And the information, what we're going to be talking today, or the insights, is really, really helpful for people to get through that and to sustain harmony. Because when you always like fighting and whatever, it leads to a lot of self-doubt. What is wrong with me? I can't sustain a relationship. I'm always fighting, breaking up, finding a new boyfriend, or fighting. So it is a theme that happens a lot. Friends have said, how's your relationship going? And people will say it goes up and down. And then the second part will be, how it goes. So it's like kind of collectively we have this idea that love goes up and down. But actually, when you really explore love and go into it deeply, you realize it's something, it's our essence, it's who we are. It's a state, whether we recognize it as such or not. So a state is something which is constant. What is going up and down is not the love, but the emotions and the level of emotions. So when the level of emotions is high, we can't feel the love. And when the level of emotions drops, we can feel the love again. And we've all experienced that. You have a big argument, suddenly the thing turns and boom, you're connected. You can feel the love again. So it's really important for us to examine this emotions aspect and how we can monitor that and manage that so that we don't have these so many times of disconnection and so on.
As you mentioned in the bio, usually we can find you speaking about how to have conscious sex, but today our subject is specifically tantric love, feeling versus emotions. So what's the difference between an emotion and a feeling?
Yes, it's a huge difference, and normally we don't understand the difference. Now, before I want to go into that, Keith, I'd just like to say that really, if we into personal growth and develop self-development, it's good to have awareness on 3 levels. And the first is the body, second is the mind, and the third is emotions. Now, body is relatively easy because it's here, you can touch it. Mind, not so easy because, we float away in thought for a long time. And the emotions is a very, very subtle layer. That's why when we're in what we can call the emotional state, we get very identified with it, because when emotions are active, they move through a sheet or layers in the body called fascia. And it's a pretty comprehensive system of tissue in the body. And so we feel like we are the emotion. So there's a high level of identification when we are emotional. So it does need quite a lot of awareness to recognize and cut through that. Now, the difference basically between emotion and feeling is that feeling is something that relates to the present moment, and emotion is something that relates to the past. So when we don't allow feelings in the present moment, whatever they are, if we don't allow them through and repress them, they become emotions. So what we can say is that all our emotions is our body of unexpressed feelings, which is obviously something that that we accumulate from very young. And it's good to understand this distinction, because we use the words emotion and feeling totally interchangeably, like it means the same thing, but it's actually really, really 2 worlds apart. Barry Long, who was an Australian master that I learned a little bit with, he drew this distinction, and it's really, really been very, very helpful, because it gives you a way to see through it.
Just to be clear, we try and just use language as well when we're working with people and differentiate between this very thing you're saying, emotion versus feeling. I've had a tendency, for instance, to go to the word sensation versus feeling, because feeling somehow might come across as something that can be subjective. Like, how do you feel today? I feel good. I feel bad. Whereas something like sensation might be, oh, there is this pressure in my thigh and it has these qualities. And if there was a scientist here, they could measure the electrical differential of the tissue of the fascia that I'm just wondering, are you clarifying more that feeling is more this, what our body is sensing without any kind of bias and some kind of totally objective level? Is that what feeling means in the context that you're saying?
Not really. It's not the kinesthetic sense. It's more like sadness, anger, depression, love, feelings on that level. And you see, we live in a society that we're not encouraged to allow our feelings. So if you're a kid and you start crying, like especially if you're a boy, you're told you're a girl, stop crying, you're like a girl. So you start to shut down. If you're angry as a kid, your parents will discipline you as you get older. So right from childhood, also, there's a lot of experiences we have as children. I mean, there's a lot of sexual abuse, and that's another thing. But if that is a situation, something that happens to you, there's a lot of confusion, a lot of many feelings associated with that experience, fear and being paralyzed, that you don't allow through the system.
So it's the repression or the non-processing of these feelings in real time that then become emotions.
Exactly. Absolutely, yes. And certainly that whole body of kinesthetic feelings is very important for being present and being more sensitive, especially in the lovemaking. What happens is when we don't allow our feelings, they get stored and go sour. And this is the disturbance, because when emotions get active, we actually move into quite a toxic state, and we say things and do things that later we can easily regret. But fortunately, there are some really clear indicators as to when you can know that you are in emotion. Because once you learn the little tips, then it's like you can understand where you are and do something about it, instead of people just go into confusion and start to doubt their love. So one of the first indicators, or symptoms, but indicators is better, the word, is instant feeling of disconnection. So you can be with your partner, you can be having a nice time, and then one word or a reference to something, or can even be the tone of the voice, then suddenly like a wall comes down. There's disconnection, you feel paralyzed, you feel kind of disconnected from your partner, but also from yourself. So that is like the first indicator that somehow the past is stepping into the present. Something from the past has been triggered, and that's what the reaction is. Nothing to do with this person in the moment. The other very telling symptom or indicator is that if you're emotional, or if you're going short before, it's very hard to look a person in the eyes. You will always be looking to the side. You can't look straight on. Another one is a very common tendency with emotions is they blame the other person for the unhappiness. So there's always this phrase, you always and you never. And you can change partners, and it's the same, you always and you never, same thing, which is really clearly showing, this is something I'm carrying from before. It's not to do with my partner. So in my book, I mean, there's a long list. It's things like emotions are always trying to change the other person. They're very self-righteous, like I'm right and you are wrong. And until you admit that you're wrong. The other thing would be that they love to argue and discuss emotions. And people start arguing, and you and go further and further into quagmire, into separation. They happen, it's repeating patterns. For instance, the same issue will come up again and again and again. Normally, we're very like mind-oriented, even that it's a strong experience in the body. We in our mind, and it will kind of like go around and around and find reasons for why you're unhappy. And the main thing why it's important is to recognize is because of this aspect of toxicity that I started out by saying. Because emotions are toxic and they love revenge. So they're going to say all kinds of things. And always in my groups, when we discussing this subject, I just say, often what I say to always, who's recognized that they feel toxic when they're emotional? And everybody puts their hands up. So it's something we recognize, but we don't really know what it is or how to deal with it. one thing that is important for me to say is that to be emotional is not wrong. But not to know that you're emotional or recognize that you're emotional and take responsibility for that, that is wrong. In the sense of that you can do something, say something that can have lifelong consequences. Emotion is not wrong because we all have many reasons for repressing our feelings. I mean, our society does not encourage feelings. But when we start to recognize that we're emotional, this is so, so important.
I think this is a really crucial point you're making, this idea of emotion itself not being wrong, but not being consciously aware or present of that emotional state moving through you is, well, we could use the word wrong, but, it's unhelpful, right? It's going to be very destructive to the dynamic that we're in exchange with another person. And I think this comes up a lot in, let's take the traditional relationship model of a heterosexual couple. It must often come up where the male is potentially more repressed, and I'm talking in big umbrella terms here. I know every individual is different, but they're not maybe moving clearly into their emotional state, but in fact they are. They're maybe more shut down, more contracted, more disconnected. And then a woman may be more potentially openly emotional in these states, maybe tearful, maybe more overt. And I've heard it time and time again in dynamics where that accusation of, oh, you're too emotional, I can't talk to you while you're like this. But there's emotions, in fact, moving through both individuals. It's the way that they're expressing in that triggered state that is, in fact, less clear potentially. And you could inverse those roles into individuals very clearly. Sometimes women are more repressed and quiet and contracted, and the men more overt, of course. But it's really interesting to hear about that. And we talk about that in field dynamics maybe as moving into a state of distortion or, a triggered aspect within the field, an old pattern of behavior, a belief being activated. And as you say, it's like a time capsule. This could be about relationships past. It could be about relationship with parental figures, even transpersonal content. And yet it's expressing in that most intimate dynamic of our partner.
Yes, absolutely. And the thing is that is the safe place. It's the safest place to let go these kind of patterns, because we know we're not, we feel safe with the person we're closest to. So you wouldn't go into that pattern with your colleague, for instance. So it's because we're so safe that we do go into these patterns. And also we do get, triggered very easily. But I would just, like, when you say, like, women are more emotional, you see, I would say women are more in touch with their feelings. Just to start to, it's difficult to get that distinction, because I often think, well, you see, like, people at some live tennis games or rugby or, I don't know, football. I was so emotional. Now, I understand exactly what they're saying, but how would you say that in a rephrase it? I was so full of feeling, or I was like so excited or so elevated. It's really, really helpful, because once you start to recognize that just through those few indicators, then you can start to do something. And what is interesting is that all the things that we feel when we don't allow our feelings, in other words, when we're emotional, when we actually allow the feelings, the true feelings, then the opposite is experienced. So, for instance, when I'm with you and you, my dearly beloved, and I allow my feelings, we feel connected. When you allow the feelings, you feel expanded. You feel open. You're more self-revealing. You're not protecting and so on. So it's really helpful. Like, the information we're going to talk about today is how to deal with your past, right? When that comes into play. But it's very helpful to start to allow the feelings when they come up, if it's tears or shivering or shaking or even anger. But when these things are moved through you and you allow them, it actually improves the connection. But when they come in the repressed form, there's the separation.
I'm just curious, and something that something you said that Christabel and I have reflected on, that it's with our intimate partners and the people who are closest to us in our life in which we tend to act out these emotional inner landscapes and work through those projections, etc. And there's kind of a twofold consideration here. One is, how strange is it in a way that everyone has a private self when they're in their most imbalanced, most emotional state, that they never really show to most of the world, but pretty much just show to those closest to them. Because like you said, there's safety, there's something like that. And yet within that safe, I care about you the most relationship, I'm also going to bring forward the most imbalanced, darkest aspects of myself. And that aspect of ourselves is basically, for most people, for 90-something% of people, is never on display publicly. So you can never know what a person you meet casually is like in their most triggered state. They'll never show that to you. And that public versus private persona is really fascinating to me, that everyone in the whole world is like this. And yet we only get to see those 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 people who are closest to us actually ever show that soft underbelly. And I'm just wondering what you think about that in relation to the sacredness of intimate relationships, and that's the sacred nature, and the acknowledgement of them is so vital to being able to understand that context.
Well, I think it's basically just a little bit of a blind spot. We don't really understand it. Even when it's happening, we don't know actually what's going on. There's just a lot of confusion, a whole mixture of kind of experiences. And I think it's a lack of education. Same with sex. It's a bit of a blind spot. The thing is that we think this is how humans behave, and that's the problem. So as a child, if you see your parents being emotional the whole time, you think that's how you behave. So there's no real screen or filter. Like, say, I have a friend, she just went to see her mother. Now, her mother's very ill. Her mother is lovely to everybody else around her, the caretakers, the nieces, but to her daughter, she is toxic because the daughter has got no choice but to stay there. There is so much toxicity that in the end, you can't handle it, but family stays together. We don't really understand the importance of allowing feelings, whatever they are, and how, when they are repressed, how they do impact us on a very great level. Many people have been to us and said, we had one fight too many in my previous relationship. So it really shows. Love is very resilient. It bounces back. We know that. The wall comes down, love is there. But too much toxicity, after a while, it really can burn the love out. So that's why, especially if it's like repeating patterns and repeating arguments, it's really good to cut through and start to deal with it. And then, things look much cleaner because you're taking responsibility for your past.
Yeah, thanks, Diana, for using that word. I think there's something really crucial here. I love the way that you're reframing here this idea of taking responsibility for these emotional tracks, right? So firstly, there's bringing presence and consciousness to it, because this is something a lot of people aren't comfortable referring to. But there's often a member within a family or a grouping, however you choose your family model in life, where there is this sort of toxic element. And as you said, and family constellations touches on this, the kind of orders of love, or the rules of that group, of that family, are such that, well, we don't disown each other, we stay regardless. And I love this idea of taking responsibility and being able to reframe this to, well, how is this moving through me? How can I bring presence and understanding? And Keith touched on this when he's saying, actually, our intimate relationships are an opportunity, if we're able to do so, of being a very sacred contract to do this work, because we're dealing with a mirror. We're literally able to lock and key, mirror each other's triggers and patterns. And if we're able to have the understanding, the skill set, the consciousness to stick around, as you say, and to continue to work through those, we can really provide a great holding space and gift for ourselves and the other individual.
Exactly, that you wouldn't have with a stranger. But within that same unit, like you say, you can really protect the sacredness. And that's why, like, once you get that knack with a person who's close to you, then of course it can extend out too, because emotions, unexpressed feelings come up in all kinds of situations. One gets triggered in many different situations, can be in the queue in the shop. Do you know what I mean? And then something like,
Yeah, absolutely. So from your perspective, with all this experience you've had and working with couples over the years, what is it we can do when we're emotional? I mean, Field Dynamics have our own perspective on this and working with the field, but we'd love to hear more here about, I believe you refer to it as the 5 steps to transforming emotion.
Right. And the first thing is awareness, like you're saying, consciousness, presence, but is to notice that you suddenly feel disconnected, or that you can't look the person in the eyes, or you start blaming them or complaining a lot. So all these indicators, little lights should go off. And just like, my God, I'm emotional. And then the biggest thing is to say, I am emotional. And that is the hardest thing, because when we're in the emotional state, it's an ego state. I'm right, you're wrong, and until you admit da-da-da-da-da-da. So for you to admit, that you're emotional, the ego does not like it. But once you say it, and especially if you practice saying it, again and again, it just becomes easier. So first, awareness and presence to recognize that you're emotional, then to say aloud you're emotional to your partner. And then generally we say separate. In other words, the emotional person says, I'm emotional. I need some time for myself. I am coming back. Because what do we see in the movies? This is also part of our imprinting. The door gets slammed. The person storms out, and the one left behind is like, oh, so it's very important. Recognize that you're emotional. Say you're emotional. I need some time for myself, and I'm coming back. And then you go and you move your body. Some physical activity, because when emotions are active, they move through the fascia. And so it's a substantial part of the body. In fact, every body is like 23 kilograms of fascia. So if you move your body, you burn up that emotion. So it can be jogging or hitting a pillow or vacuuming or something, but you need to do it with intention, not just like, half-hearted. And it sounds very simplistic, but it really, really, really does work. And you might need to do that for a few hours. And then you come back to your partner and see, are you back in the moment? Can you look them in the eyes? Is the wall still there? And you will be able to see, oh, the wall is down, or, oh, no, it's still a bit there. And you go and you move your body a bit more. And then eventually you come back. Now, it sounds, like I say, it sounds simplistic, but what I do know, it works. And the mind very often wants more complex solutions to analyze and discuss. But if you start like that, the time frame between being triggered and recognizing you're emotional to resolving it gets shorter and shorter and shorter. And so like now for me, things that with my partner used to irritate me or push my buttons, now I laugh, So these things do get burnt up once they start to be acknowledged and felt, lived. I say, generally speaking, that it's good if people, the emotional one says, I'm going, no? Sometimes, depending on a person's background, the other partner can easily feel abandoned or something. So that is a delicate thing. But the point is, that a couple has to work out for themselves. But the important thing is that, you say you're coming back. If you stay together, the chances are you might just carry on arguing and discussing and not actually resolving it. Now, obviously, we can move our body and all that. Optimum is actually to access the feeling that was not expressed previously. So that is optimum. So one can access those feelings. It's slightly more mature, one can say. You come into the region of the solar plexus, feel what you feel, and kind of let it arise. Because that's actually what we want to do, is burn up, or like bring into the fresh air, the light, a feeling that was not expressed, say in the early childhood. Like, for example, subjectively speaking, almost everybody had the experience of abandonment as a kid. I can remember it very clearly. I think I must have been about 5. My parents they were great, lived in South Africa. They went fishing for weeks and weeks and weeks, camping on the beach, and they farmed out each of the kids with a different family. And when they came back, I just could not look them in the eyes. I didn't want to see them. I hid away from them. Now, most children will tell you something like this. So that's why abandonment is something that comes up again and again and again in a relationship, and even when you change partners, because it's a very old wound. But if you can actually access the feelings related to that and allow the original feelings, then you really worked through something, and then the abandonment issue won't come up so often.
I'm wondering, like, what you're talking about, this would be a revolution for the average home, average couple in the world, because the human condition does not seem to be one that people, aside from just individual level responsibility and maintenance or attendance to their imbalances, to do that within a couple, right, or a spousal relationship, that's yet another step. So how do you see this in terms of who this applies to? And if it was just a small amount of people who are interested in this at the moment, really stepping into this, how might we envision this kind of orientation being more common?
Well, I mean, I think we just have to hope for the best for humanity and keep putting in the good things and see what people take out. But really, I've taught thousands and thousands of couples, and the number of couples who just say that the sexual component that we learned from you was really important, and it stands equally next to the emotions and feelings. It just changes your life, that you're not always in this anxiety and stress state. It changes family lives. Like, we say there's a few golden rules, right? It's like, if you're parents, you never fight in front of your children. So you're not toxic with each other, and you're not emotional with your children. Now, being emotional is different to discipline. You can still discipline a child, but with no, toxicity. And you see, when parents are fighting in front of their children, or being sarcastic, or semi-toxic, the children feel it completely, and they start to shrink and become then very demanding. So many parents have told us, our family life changed. They could feel more love between us. Something in their being relaxes. And so then you start to raise a very, very different kind of a child, because they're not walking around in fear. Because actually, ultimately, when we're in the emotional state, there's many indicators, but the main one is fear. Well, I think it would just be a very different world. And I think it's all couples, all families are hampered by this, not understanding, what's actually going on. They think it's personal. It's to do with this person, but it's not. It's to do with something that happened in the past. Now, if you've been in a relationship for 20, 30 years with somebody, you are going to have things in your own time together that you could have dealt with better. But then you recognize that, like, if only I had known that 15 years ago, and I'm really sorry. And you can start to forgive each other, and come from a place of understanding. Whole countries are emotional with each other. Colleagues, friends, families, the thing is, in the couple relationship, that's where you can start. That's the most important base. And then you can really start to practice, because if you say with your boss and suddenly, you're having a discussion and suddenly you feel yourself disconnected. Now, you could then go into an argument with the boss, but it's much better. You can't suddenly say, I'm emotional. Excuse me. I need a little time for myself. I'm coming back. What I would do is just say, excuse me, I don't think this is a good time to talk about it. Can we have a break? Can we come back to the subject tomorrow? So you get yourself out of the situation as soon as possible, because we all know it. You can say awful things that you regret. Keith, I think it is so important. I think it is it's just so important.
We're really, and you're talking here, Diana, about the micro to the macro, as it were, right? So we have our one-on-one relationships, and then all the ways that this reverberates out into the world through the family dynamic, through workplace, through broader community, and then to countries, humanity, right? Civilization and that collective field. So this is the ultimate adage, really, that Keith and I talk about a lot with field dynamics, which is, doing your own personal healing is healing for the whole. Absolutely. And a lot of what you're sharing is connecting here to some of the major contemplative traditions. So we talk about this idea of burning up the feeling, right? And we think about the art of meditation, where we're becoming more and more present. And over time, these emotional charges will start to arise in the system. And we're learning to traction with them, to be present as they're moving through. And, the traditions talk about purification. We might talk about healing in other contexts. So it's really bringing that practice from the mat, from those traditions, to our day-to-day living, to our interactions in a very practical manner. And as part of that, I'm interested in this stepping stone. So we all know what it is to be in that full-blown triggered state. You've identified very well these emotions that we're experiencing. But what about this sort of stepping stone of, I think you refer to it as leaking our emotions prior to becoming fully blown out, fully triggered, fully sort of up and out, as it were? What's happening there, and what can people look out for so they can start to titrate this emotional state better?
Right. Very good. Yes, we call it low-grade emotions. So it's a little bit like having a low-grade tooth infection. And some people live totally in that state, always in what can say a low-grade state. And for other people, and for me it's a stepping stone. So one of the things, to have an eye on that. So one of the things is complaining a lot. A lot of complaining about anything. This is, a sign of emotions rising. Another one is you're very prickly. So somebody says something to you and you just shoot out little darts. Do you know what I'm saying? Little toxic remarks. You just throw them into the atmosphere. You're very irritable, and you let that show in your voice, because we can say something ordinarily, or we can say it, like it's irritating us. So that's already conveying. And impatience is a sign of low-grade emotions. And when you start to lose your sense of humor, now humor is vital for this life. If you don't have humor, it's difficult. So obviously, when you're in a full-blown emotional state, you definitely don't have humor. But when you start to notice that you lose your humor and you get a bit serious, this is also an indicator. And also with the complaining, it can also be internally complaining about somebody, your boyfriend or girlfriend, or, and it's going round and around, like he always, he never, da, 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 da. So it can also be happening in the mind. So that is, really important to start to have awareness of that. And if you do notice that you're in a low-grade state, the same thing is move your body. Because a lot of us, we live in a very static society. We sit here, we sit there, we sit there. So we're not moving much, right? But if you move on a more regular basis, you're moving congestions and tensions or whatever through, and you're likely to be less emotional. So it's in a way, it's the same kind of medicine for full-blown emotion or low-grade emotions. But yeah, it's so great that we see things in a, we're kind of like complimenting each other, but you in the field, and then, yeah, excellent. One golden rule is that you never tell somebody that they're emotional, because that is, unless you really are mature and you have an agreement, because it's easier for someone on the, for you to see somebody else's emotions than your own. So we say you never tell somebody, because if you do, you're likely to, it's really going to aggravate their situation, and they, could easily get more emotional. So, yeah, it's a really helpful way of dealing with the baggage that we all bring into our relationship. We all do. We bring something from the past. And if we can start to separate out, this belongs to my past, then we can protect love. And that is the whole point, that we are protecting the love from the toxicity. And then the more you do it, the more harmony you have, the more harmony around you. And, you can then start to apply it, in more, with colleagues and so on. But I think that's really something that will happen by itself. The main thing is like to clean up your own garden, and realize, okay, these weeds are here, or this dry wood is here. Let's do a little pruning, but it does need the awareness. And again, to say, it's not wrong to be emotional. And I said, what's wrong is not to recognize. And you said, well, it's not wrong, it's unhelpful, which is very nice.
What about sex and emotions, when we're talking in general thus far about, emotions coming up in normal daily life routines, etc.? What about during intimacy or sex itself?
Well, it's a delicate thing, because when you start to make love consciously, one of the byproducts is that things will move out of the system on a cellular level. So old feelings can come up. They might come up as emotions, which you suddenly go into some kind of separation, or they might come up as feelings. Now, this is very, very good. These things come up because they're stored in the cells. So that's why it's useful also to know the difference. That says suddenly I'm making love and a huge wave of anger comes up, and I think it's my partner. And it's like, no, 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 no. I am angry. I've got good reason to be angry, but it's not because of him. Because everybody has anger, especially around sex. So in that sense, this information is very helpful when you are making love consciously, because the awareness displaces the past. But another aspect is that conventional sex, and I'm talking about sex that's is involving a lot of intensity and friction and building up of tension, that you're bringing this to a peak and then you discharging, relaxing it away. This is a source of our emotions, because actually what we are doing when we intentionally build up, the intensity to an orgasm, we are using sensation and tension. And actually, so what we are discharging is kind of like an overcharge and tension. It's not really to do with the magnetics and the sensitive part of the body, like the magnetic exchange, which is to do with orgasmic experiences. When we have sex in a way that every time the energy goes downwards, okay? So what the spiritual masters say is that when energy moves downwards, tension is the byproduct. So even if we do discharge a lot of the tension, there is a remnant, and that remnant the body is so intelligent, it's just amazing. It will try and move this tension out the body, and it comes out in low-grade emotions or full-blown emotions. And actually, if you look at the history of women, what are women? What's our main label? Hysterical, emotional. Now, nobody would ever really connect that to how we make love and how women are treated and how women's body is misunderstood, meaning she needs much more time to open her body. She's often feels very used. So this tension finds its way out. It's become to define women, right? But men also, men are known as restless, quite aggressive, but this is all to do with this tension that resides in a system after the release in a conventional orgasm. Now, the masters they say when tension moves down, when energy moves down, tension is the byproduct. When energy moves up, silence is the byproduct. Now, anybody who's had more relaxed sex that hasn't pushed it to a peak, hasn't maybe even come, you feel much more still inside. Or if you've done meditation, when energy's moved upwards, you feel more silent. So the direction that the energy goes in the body is of significance. So that's why this, if the only way you make love is through in the conventional way, and orgasm, which is pleasant, it's not to, knock that, but it does have consequences. And when we start to change the way we make love, we really reduce also the emotionality. So you can work with your past, dealing with it like I need time, recognizing I'm emotional, take time. And you can also manage it through starting to change the way you make love, be more relaxed in love making, not pushing so much for the peak and the discharge. And the other way is to start to allow the feelings. And it's so interesting because, like, one thing Barry Long said, like, when you access a feeling at its root, it lasts 7 or 8 seconds. Now, I suddenly understood something, because I'd been told by therapists for years that I was emotionally blocked and da-da-da-da. But what I realized was, unbeknown to me, I was accessing my feelings at the source. So in 7, 6, 7, 8 seconds, it would be gone. Now, that was interpreted by me and therapists. Oh, my gosh, she's blocked. But if you catch them in the beginning and follow them through, they move very quickly. And many people know that. Because of my childhood and so on, I really repressed my tears. So I was always longing to cry and cry and cry and cry, And look, I have done that for sure. It's wonderful. But it's just that in some kind of situations, it would come up and then just suddenly be gone. And then I understood it's 7 or 8 seconds. And it's the same with anger. Like, if you access really on track with anger and you move it with it, it's amazing. It's just like one blast of your body. I remember one situation where I was with a boyfriend of mine and we've been going on, and then suddenly he turned to me, and I was trying to be I knew he was emotional, and I was being very balanced and everything. And then suddenly he turned and said, "You," and I won't go into all the details, but he said, "And you are," and I just like exploded in anger. But it was amazing. I just shot up to the roof and came down on my feet, and it was gone. So it was just like this pure explosion of energy. And so one thing with anger is always good to turn from a person. So you never, even that it's pure, it's strong. You never, if you suddenly feel anger is moving, you just turn away. Because in some therapies, they do use somebody as a person, like, this is maybe your father and I'll beat a cushion or something. And so you're directing anger towards. You see, the thing is, anger in its purity is beautiful, and it can save your life. I also remember a situation in London Underground, and it was very late at night, and I heard someone, there's like very long, dark tunnels and gloomy tunnels in London, especially, 40 years ago. And I heard somebody walking behind me quite deliberately and shaking some keys, so I turned around and there was a man flashing with an erection and whatever. And honestly, I just got such a shock that I let out this like roar. which literally like blasted him away. And he just kind of like, turned and went. Thank God, I'm not saying it's going to guarantee, but it's a guarantee to protection, but it just, that energy is a healthy energy. It's when we don't allow it, then it goes toxic, and anger is very toxic. And, we just don't need to go into all the details about, what's happening on the anger level in the relationships and so on. So start to stay abreast with feelings. Like if you love somebody, tell them, I had experiences like with certain boyfriends along the way. It's like, oh, I don't want to show that because, then he knows how plugged in I am. Then you feel depressed a little bit later, or tears come. And you like in our society, people are so fast to brush away tears and apologize, like, oh, I'm so sorry. Like you often see that in television, in reality shows or interviews and so on. Just allow the tears. And this is where it's easier for women than men because of the male conditioning. And again, men are not responsible. It's just we live in this really crazy society where men have to armor themselves, to be a real man. And so we always like say to men, because men have as many feelings as women. They're as sensitive as women. It's just they have had to, put up little barriers. So yeah, allowing the feelings, sharing, and one thing I think that's really helpful within a couple is that couples don't talk too much about the past. To really, a lot of talking is always about the past or sometimes the future, but going over things, just let the past go and start to like establish something more grounded, in the present.
There's just one follow-up question I'd like to ask to what you were sharing with relationship to the sexual exchange, more conscious sex. If a couple find themselves in a scenario where an emotion is arriving, if they're trying to be more conscious in their sex life and they find themselves in the scenario where an emotion is arising in the moment, I'd just like to ask what the best steps are for them to deal with that. It might be an unexpected emotion. It might, not seem to have context to what's happening.
Yes, it's just good to say, I feel disconnected now. Like if it's a feeling, it can be great sadness to allow through. So if it's really coming up on a feeling level, not to disconnect. If the penis is inside, stay there because the penis is triggering a purification. So try and stay and just let it through. But if it has come to the disconnect, where it's more like in an emotional way, then just to stay, but somehow stay together. Like for me, I remember like anger came up a few times and I would just separate from the man and then just go and stand next to the bed and just jump, hoo, arms in the air, coming down on my heels, and just then and there burn it up. But if, sometimes things come up from every corner, you don't actually know, then you just say, look, something important is coming up. I need time for myself. You stay here in bed. I'm coming back. So you could still, find a way to work with it or stay together, but the one person is just working through it on their own. One thing that is important is not really so, we find that it's not so important to understand what's going on in the sense of what is being triggered, where is it coming from. So some people like to talk about it afterwards and really analyze what is the trigger points and so on. We don't think that's so helpful. I think you might get an insight and that's what it is. And that's different. But you don't need to know where it's coming from, especially when you kind of in the process. You don't want to distract yourself by thinking, going into thought, oh, what is this? Was my father beat me physically as a kid or because of my sexual boundaries? You just want to stay with the body and let the body, purify. But there's some therapies say, well, it's good to understand each other's trigger points, but I think that I wouldn't like to know all my partner's trigger points, because then I'd be like walking around, on eggs, trying not to push his buttons. But that's just me. I mean, some people might find it helpful. But I think the main point there is that you don't need to know what's going on. Just work through, come back into love, into the present. Definitely, like I said previously, it gets shorter. The fuse gets shorter and shorter and shorter. The main thing is to start recognizing. And it can be, 2 days before you really recognize and acknowledge.
To bring things full circle, might you contextualize love in relation to emotions here?
Well, it's really this thing that love is a state of being. And it's we are born in love, and our essence is love. Now, many of us are separated from that essence because of fear, because fear and love are opposites. And most people are living in a state of fear from outside reasons. And so we disconnected from that love. But just to understand that love is always there. What we need to do is nourish that love and protect it from our emotionality. It's very clear, especially when you start to make love consciously, that you start to realize, love is a state of being. And when you start also to recognize how love feels, and we kind of think love is a lot to do with the other person, but actually you are love. You are love. And, if you are love, then of course you're going to love somebody else, but you are the source.
What a fantastic note, Diana, to bring things to a close on. I love that. Really powerful statement. We'd love for you to share, as we move to a close here, any upcoming projects or classes or ways people can reach you.
Well, sweet. Thank you. Look, I'm doing my workshops in Switzerland. It's far away from where you are. And projects, I'm trying to do less and less. But 70 soon, and not that I'm retiring or anything. But yeah, people can find me on my website, livinglove.com or loveforcouples.com, and really suggest to read my book, this Tantric Love, Feeling versus Emotions, or on my website, I've got 3 interviews, and one of them is about emotions, so they could listen to something similar again. But it really, really helps. And I know a lot of people, psychologists even, many come to our group and they often a bit stunned, like, oh my God, you wrapped up in 45 minutes, 1 hour, what we, actually can take really a long time to convey to somebody or understand. So it's really a shortcut. And so we had, in all the books, there's a chapter on this, but then pulled it out to make a separate book, because not everybody's going to find that information in the lovemaking books. It's something that applies to families. I mean, people give it to each other as presents. A good Christmas present. Okay, well, look, it's been so nice to see you again. And thank you very much. Love your inputs and your sharings and what you're doing over there.
Thank you, Diana. A real pleasure, and such an important topic today. I know so many people will benefit from this content and the other resources you've shared. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Doug. Much love.
Thanks for listening to the episode. What really supports the podcast is providing a rating and review of the show on your preferred listening platform. This helps us get the message out to a wider audience. If the topics we discussed today appeal to you, do take a moment to subscribe. Lastly, we invite you to check out our website, fielddynamicshealing.com, to learn about our training programs, private session work, and to see how we're setting the standard in contemporary energy healing. Many thanks, and see you next time.